Also pray that you meet our needs financially. We trust you completely in that. We know you're in charge and you own everything, and we're just stewards. We pray that we would be good stewards in the light of all the things you have done for us personally and how you have blessed us materially. So we commit this time to you as we give our gifts. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Stand with us one more time here this morning as we sing a new hymn.
Come behold the wondrous mystery in the dawning of the King. He the theme of heaven's praises, robed in frail hue,
Well, we do have a pretty good group that stayed. That's great. I know how these conferences work. Last day, head for the barn. Right, Jim? Yeah, I am. I have turned the corner. Usually when I'm in Asia, India, or Africa, about 3 weeks is max. 3 weeks, I'm ready to turn the corner and head for the barn. But this one got extended. We started in Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia. And we have partners in each of those countries. In fact, we're in 6 countries with 7 different partnering associations. So 3 of them are new to us that I had never visited before. So I needed to go visit them. And, you know, when you're in the region, you can't ignore the ones that are already your partners. So, and all of these countries have contiguous borders. So, you know, they're all right in one region. So that was why this trip got longer and longer, and we have to just have a mindset that says we're still here, you know, keep focused. Been good to be with you. Once again, I want to say how much I appreciate Jim and Jeannie. They have hosted me at the ministry center. We've been in your hospitality suite, and have so much appreciated that. That's a tremendous asset for this fellowship that God has given to you. And I know that you use it, and Jim makes maximum use of that for training and all of that, and it's wonderful. I don't know any fellowship that has anything like that to that extent. So that's a great asset for your fellowship. But I've just appreciated their fellowship, and I appreciate Jim's vision, his passion, his leadership that he provides, and resourcing pastors. That's what he's all about, resourcing pastors. And that's what I'm about too. And we just do it in different regions, but I just so much appreciate that. Sometimes when I'm overseas, I'm pretty overwhelmed by the commitment of our partners, and seeing them with this, you know, church planting DNA, and they're in the midst of poverty and challenges that are unique to their area, unlike anything we face, and yet they're about it. They're just out there doing it. And I sometimes wish we could, you know, transport some of that back here to the States. But for me, it's just humbling to be with them. I learn a lot when I go. You know, you go to be a teacher, but you better be a student. And I certainly learn a lot from them. I envision that this session might become interactive, and I'm really good with that. In terms of questions, comments, additions, that will fill out our session, and we'll gain wisdom collectively if we do that. So I hope that you'll feel that way. We're going to talk about the barriers to ethnicity, understanding that the commandment that God's given to us in the Great Commission is that we're to make disciples of all ethnes, all people groups. And we referenced that last night, the fact that we have an immigration problem here in the U.S. And don't worry, we're not going to wade into that. There are a lot of political ways to attack that. But for the Church of Jesus Christ, these are days of opportunity, because the world has moved here. And our commandment from the Lord, our marching orders, have to do with the ethnes of the world. And now they're here, and they live where we live. And there's no singular or simple answer as to how to reach them. There are different approaches. I love the fact that when I go into a church that is multi-ethnic, I mean, I love that. I look out and it's, salt and pepper and cinnamon. It's all there. And I'm like, this is the body of Christ. But there there are also approaches to ethnicity of planting churches in ethnic neighborhoods that end up being homogenous, and it's okay, as long as we do it for the right reasons. As long as we do it with love and intentionality and cooperation, not because we don't want them in our church. Now, move back a few decades, and unfortunately, that was how we responded to ethnicity. And, of course, African Americans, we said, well, we'll plant African American churches. And the reason was because we didn't want them in our churches. And that's a terrible mark on our history. But as long as we have the right intention and the love of God is in our hearts and being poured out, it's okay for us to plant churches that are ethnically homogenous and they're reaching their own neighborhoods, as well as multi-ethnic. As I said, there's no simple answer. There's no singular answer. When I was pastoring in, my last pastorate was in Daniels Road Baptist Church in Fort Myers, Florida. And I had a man come in on a Thursday afternoon, no appointment, knocked on the door, came in. He said, and he had his 10-year-old son who was his translator. And through his son, he told me that he had been sent there by a Baptist church in Brazil to plant a Portuguese-speaking church in Fort Myers. And would I help? Well, first thing, I didn't know there were any Portuguese speakers in Fort Myers. I mean, I don't speak Spanish, and I can't tell the difference between Spanish and Portuguese. And I knew we had about 20% Spanish population in Fort Myers, but I didn't know we had any Portuguese speakers. So that was my first question. I said, well, are there Portuguese speakers here? He said 5,000. I'm like, ooh, that's significant. So over the next 2 months, with the help of his son, we talked through who he was, who he represented, what is his doctrinal basis. Could we work together? And we determined, yes, we could. And so we had just finished building a new auditorium, so we had an auditorium, and in the hours that we weren't using it, we turned that over to them. And gave them 2 offices, one for the pastor, one for his secretary, and we began working together. And we did some crossover stuff. We immediately started an ESL class, and these Portuguese-speaking adults would come into class, and we held it at the very same time that we had Awana. So the kids just funneled into Awana, and the adults came into ESL, and it worked great. Now, it was good for our church. Ethnicity is not just skin color. We all know that. There are cultural differences. And our service started in the evening, Sunday night at 6 o'clock, and they started their service at 8 o'clock. And I think they went to 11 or 12, okay? And Friday nights, they had all-night prayer meetings. And we weren't there. We didn't do any all-night prayer meetings. But every Friday night, they had an all-night prayer meeting. Well, as a pastor, you finish up, and the service closes at 7, and you don't get out of there right away. And so often, it was, 8:30, I'd be walking out. Their service started at 8, but I'd be walking out, and there'd be, families just arriving. I'm like, didn't your service start at 8 o'clock? They just smile. Brazilian time. As a white American, that would drive me crazy. Okay? But culturally, that was acceptable. Their music was different from ours. Really, a lot more lively. I would have liked to injected some of their enthusiasm into our service. And the sound system that we had in our in our old auditorium, it was never turned up as loud as when they used it. Crank that baby all the way up. It was just different. It was different. And we helped them for 2 years, and then they were able to get their own building and establish the first Brazilian Baptist Church of Fort Myers. It was very cool. And we did crossover services where he came and preached, and with a translator, of course. And I preached in their church, and we did some of that. But it was a very healthy relationship, and they didn't actually mix in with us, but there were language barriers, see? And so they started their own, and they're reaching their own people. That's not the only way to do it. It was just a way to do it, and it worked. And that's what I'm saying. There's no singular answer, no simple answer to cultural differences. I remember being in India, and it was one of my first trips to India. I go to India almost every year. We have 23 partnering associations in India. So I go to different parts of India, and almost every year I'm there. But I remember sitting with this pastor in his home. There's just an alleyway separating his home from the church. And I was speaking, and I said to him in the course of the evening, "What time's the service start tonight?" And he said, 7 o'clock. I said, okay. So we're sitting there, and we're visiting, and I'm kind of nonchalantly looking at my watch, and it's 10 minutes to 7. And we're not moving, we're just talking. And it was just about 7 o'clock, and his wife walked in and says, "Dinner served." I'm like, oh my goodness. We went in and we sat down. She had full course meal. Now, I started hearing singing across the alleyway in the church. They're singing, and I'm like, "Pastor," I didn't say anything. I'm the guest. I figure I'm not late. Pastor's still here. But we sit down, we eat. About 7:45, he says, "You ready to go to church?" I'm like, "Yeah, I've been ready, So we go over, they sing a couple more songs, and then I get up to preach. And then in another setting, I heard the explanation. Not for that one, but I heard the cultural explanation. Somebody said, "Well, it's 7 o'clock until it's 8 o'clock. Really? So we were there at 7 o'clock. You've no doubt heard it said, as they say in Africa, you've heard this, "You Americans, you have watches, but we have the time." And they're event-driven, but they're not time-conscious. So singing begins, and nothing else happens till everybody gets there. And they're okay with that. It's culture. And it's different for all of us, but I was just in Africa, and I don't want to be crass here, but I was in all of these meetings. Moms breastfeed just openly in Africa. No cover, no nothing. And I saw this lady that she's in the choir is singing. She's in the choir standing, singing, breastfeeding her baby. I'm like, really? Can't you wait till you get down and sit down? It's just it's culture. It's different. For us as Americans, it's like, oh my goodness. But when I went to the church in Florida, I knew I had moved from Iowa. The church in Iowa was in the shadow of Faith Baptist Bible College, 15 miles away in Slater. In a small rural town, but if we had 2:20 in the morning, we had 180 at night. Just solid, rural farming people. And I got to Florida, and I knew it was, it was a smaller church. They'd have maybe 80 on Sunday morning in the summertime. Wintertime grows. But Sunday night was like 20. And I was like, God, why did you bring me here? These people, they don't love Jesus. They're out on their boats. And of course, Florida is a retirement state, but there are a lot of families live there, but it's a retirement state. And when I went there, this congregation, the previous pastor had retired, so that was his age bracket. The associate pastor had retired, and the congregation looked retirement age. There was only one couple in their early 30s, and the next couple was 65 and plus. The entire congregation, and I came in as a 46-year-old. And the first thing we did was we hired an associate age 26. And I said to the congregation, as a Florida church, we have to make a conscious decision, and I want to lead you in this. Are we going to reach the Floridians, or are we going to cater to the snowbirds? And I said, we've been called here as a church to be a light in this community. We've got to reach the people that are here. And by God's grace, in the next 10 years, the largest group in that church was the family class. And the nursery was full, and there were kids running all over, and it was a great delight to my heart. And God used that church to send out young people into ministry and into missions, and it was a delight to my heart to see what God was doing. But I tell you that to say, if we're going to reach a different, whether it's a generation or an ethnic group, it requires us to be intentional, to be thinking, and to realize that we have to make some changes. It just has to happen. I want to share with you some work that was actually done by Ralph Winters. Ralph Winters was a missiologist of the previous generation. He died in 2009. He was never in our camp. He was a Presbyterian. He's probably a Baptist today, but that was not an elitist comment. Okay. Very broadly evangelical, broad sweep of evangelicalism. We would not be comfortable where he served and the people he was with. However, he did some original thinking for his day. And he really made ethnic groups a target and moved away from the idea that the Great Commission has to do with countries. And in that day, he was pushing barriers that others had not tried to push at all. I have put together this is his graphic. Okay, I'm giving him credit for it. This is his graphic as he talks about the barriers to reaching ethnic groups. And let me explain this. You can see here, there we are. E0, E1, E2, E3. The numbers represent barriers, and the E is evangelism. It has to do with the one who is reaching out and the barriers that we may face as we try to reach people that are unsaved and people that are perhaps in a different ethnic group than we are. Now, E0, you'll notice E0 is inside the church. E0 saying there are no barriers. These are people who are unsaved, but they come to your church. They may be children that are yet unsaved, teenagers that are yet unsaved, unsaved husbands that come with their wives, grandparents that come on an occasion when the kids are up front. But they're people that come to your church. They, for whatever reason, you know, that's not a problem to them. They just come in your church, but they don't know the Lord. It's the easiest group to reach because there are no barriers. Now, when I talk about ease and difficulty, we're within the context understanding the Spirit of God that opens their hearts. Okay, but there are no barriers. They've already been willing to come into your church, and they're sitting there and they're hearing the message, and it's only by God's power that they will come to Christ. But there are no barriers. Now, E1 is in the same culture, but they're not inside the church. It's what Ralph Winters calls the stained glass barrier. They are people that are like you, and they live in your neighborhood, and they're of the same culture as you. However, they just don't go to church, and they don't want to go to church. And your barrier in trying to reach them is probably not going to work to just simply invite them to church, because maybe they've had a bad experience in church. Maybe your church, in its history, had some problems, and they know about that. The previous pastor ran off with the secretary, and they're like, I'm not going to that church. That church has a reputation for fighting. They've planted 3 churches, but none of them intentionally. Split here, split there, you know. And so for whatever reason, these people, they're resistant to go to church, but they're your culture. They look like you, they talk like you, but you have a barrier in reaching them, and it won't be just by invitation to come to church likely that they will come. Then we move to E2. Now we have people living in our community of a different culture. They may be Hispanic, they may be African American, they may be Asian, but there may be that English is their second or third language. So as you try to speak to them, they may be conversational, but if you try to talk to them about spiritual things, those are vocabulary words that they're not going to understand. They've not been in that kind of a context, so there's a barrier there. And there's cultural barriers, as we've just been talking about culture. You know, they've watched people go to your church, and they've seen everybody that goes in there has a coat and a tie on. Well, I don't even own a coat and tie, you know, they say. I can't go to that church. There's some cultural barriers. If they were to gather with their own people, the music that's playing is way different. And I don't mean necessarily just worldly music, but it's a different style of music. There's a lot of different things that are going on, but there's a barrier. Another barrier, it's a cultural barrier to reaching them. And again, probably they're not just going to come to your church. And then there's this E3, very different culture. Now we're talking about the Middle Eastern person. We're talking about the Indian who lives next door, who's a Hindu, has a totally different worldview than you do. There is no basis, common knowledge basis to talk to them about the Bible. They know nothing about Jesus. If they're Hindu, they might accept Jesus as one more of their 330 million gods. Maybe they're Muslim. But they have immigrated to your community, but they're very different cultures. So we've got these barriers that we have to break through. I think Jim, somewhere along the line, said, you know, we no longer have home field advantage. We no longer can just simply put our sign out and expect people to come. And we have a church culture, and different ethnic groups have a culture that's different from ours. And we're trying in some way, we want to reach them with the gospel. So, talk to me a minute. We got E1 here, same culture, but there's the stained glass barrier. What approaches? How could we break through that barrier? Outreach programs. Okay. Okay. It might help if, and I don't know where you put it, but you know, if you do it in the park rather than at the church, it's less threatening to do it in a place that's not at your church. All right. Somebody else, just a comment. Yes. Invite them into your home. Relationships. You don't invite them to church, but you got to build relationships with them to the point where, and you can invite them into your home and you build a relationship, and then maybe on another occasion you invite them and you invite another church family. And you're just building relationships, and they're like, oh, these are normal people. Different culture, but these are normal people. And because we love them and we show them, we demonstrate that love, the barrier starts to break down. But walking in the door is very hard for them. Very hard for them. When we go to E1, one of the things that we can do is, if we study their culture, we study their home country, we learn what their national holidays are, and they're out of their country. And you make a point to say, hey, I know it's this holiday for you. Why don't we celebrate it together? They're like, wow, you know, here's somebody that really cares about me. And we're going to celebrate their holiday, and you're very vulnerable, and you say, you know, I don't know how you usually fix the food. Can you fix some of your food so we can celebrate this together? And you've established something there in showing them that you care about their country, you care about them, you care about their customs, you care about their culture. And it's just a way to break through. Other ideas? Go to their events. Excellent. Go to their events. So you're the one breaking the barrier. See, they're comfortable. They're having their own event, and you take the initiative and break through the barrier. Excellent. Somebody else? Okay. There you go. They have their own restaurants. And you go there, you have to be able to eat their food. This trip, I ate Caterpillar, I ate Minnows, I ate Ugali. Many of you know, if you don't know what Ugali is, it's just like Play-Doh. Some of you maybe like it, but for me it's like Play-Doh. And it's there on the table, and you just take a chunk and you eat it, and you got this ball in your gut. But, you know, that's a staple in many African countries. They call it Ugali, they call it Sima. There's different names for it. It's a corn-based, corn flour-based, or cassava root-based dish, but I struggle with it, but I eat it, you know. I pretty much eat what's given to me, although I have some rules for my own sake. I mean, obviously you only drink bottled water, and I don't eat any fruits that I can't peel or vegetables that are not cooked. I can't eat a salad because it's all washed in their water. So you have those things. That's just for your protection. But other than that, you know, they serve, and we enjoy swallowship. That's fellowship with food, swallowship. Any other suggestions? Yes?
You meet needs and you serve.
All right, okay. You're aware of something that's going on in that family's life, and you step in to help meet a need. Great. We're all needy, and they're needy also. And when we serve them, that says a lot about our heart. Well, this scale here, it's a matrix for barriers of reaching ethnicity. Now, you could take the same scale and apply that generationally. Maybe not exactly like that, but there are generational barriers. How are we going to reach the millennials and what's the next one? What is it? Z. Yeah. I knew there was another one. Millennials old school. Yeah. But, you know, how are we going to reach them? And what are the barriers? What are some of the barriers to reaching the next generation? We don't listen. Okay, we got our own ideas. We're stuck in our own decades, and we're not willing to listen. Good. Music is different. Always has been. That's true. Every generation, there's a new kind of music, and the previous generation struggles with it. Changing your music, however, will not be the key to reaching the next generation. It's not going to be the answer, but it's maybe part of the answer of moving into something that when they walk in, they don't think they're walking backwards into antiquity, you know. What else? What that? Technology, social media, for sure. This is a generation that is music. I mean, you know, they just have these things in their ears all the time. I sit down in a plane, and if the person next to me is younger than, 40, you can't talk to them. They got stuff in their ears, which says, I don't want to talk. I have many opportunities to witness on planes, but the earbuds immediately says, I don't want to talk. Social media, how do we advertise? How do we reach into their lives? Using technology, social media, and all of that, very important. You know, by the way, some of your churches don't have websites. You know, that's how people find you. I'm treading softly here, but, I've called some of your churches repeatedly, and nobody answers the phone. You say, well, my study's not in the phone, not in the church. We don't have a full-time secretary. There are ways to do call forwarding to your cell phone. I'm never in my office. My office is in Chicago. I live in Austin, Texas. But when people call my office, they think I'm sitting there because I get the telephone call on my phone. Now, in my case, I put do not disturb from 10 to 7 because nobody knows where I am in the world. And they will call me, and it'll be 3 o'clock in the morning. Hello, how you doing? Well, I'm in China. You know, I'm not in your time zone. So, but you don't have to, you don't have to have somebody sitting there. You can use the technology that's available so that your phone is ringing and people get a live person. I'll get off my hobby horse here. I'm on the other side of the desk. I used to be on your side of the desk. Okay, now I'm on the other side trying to get a hold of you. And it's hard. And pastors, ethically, we should return calls. Right? We should return calls. I'm going to tell you a quick story. I shouldn't even tell you this, but I'm going to anyway. I have a supporting church, a large church that supports heavily our ministry. It's on the left coast. And I have called repeatedly. Pam always answers the phone on a voicemail. This is Secretary Pam. Leave a message, I'll get right back to you. Pam may have been fired 5 years ago. I don't know. She's never, ever returned a call. So in a carnal moment, admittedly, after repeatedly calling this church, telling them who I was, asking them to, call me back, I called and I didn't identify myself. I said, hey, I was on your website. I'm interested to know more about your church. Could you give me a call? Nothing. Never. I'm like, why are we in business? What is going on here? This is a large church, but it's kind of like, us 400 and no more. We've got to pick up the pace here in terms of reaching. How do we reach people, and technology and just being available and using the technology to make us available is very important. What happened? Did I click that? Huh? Okay. That's the E scale. Now here's the P scale, and it's very similar. The P scale is has to do with the prospect. Now this is from their standpoint. These are the barriers that they look at. We were looking at from our standpoint, how do we break through? But think about it from their standpoint. I love it. Look at all these phones taking pictures up here. This is a group that's with it, Take the picture, you got it. All right. Now, the P scale is the prospect himself and how he views. There are some, again, that's my fault. That's why that went away. 0, 1, 2, 3. 0 is in the church. They already come to your church. They broke them through the stained glass barrier, and they have no problem. P1 is that group that is of the same culture. They have this stained glass barrier, and from their perspective, as I mentioned, maybe they looked at your church and they've seen everybody filing in and they're all dressed up and they're like, I couldn't do that. I don't have that stuff. That might be a barrier from their perspective. I've only seen old people going in there, and I'm 25. I'm not going in there. I'm a single, and I'm not going to be comfortable in that church. There's a lot of barriers from their standpoint, and we have to think about how do we manage that so that they're not looking at our church and going, I don't think I'd be comfortable in that church. We think about the barriers from our standpoint, but I'm not sure we think about it from their standpoint and how they look at our church. And you go right down through the same thing here with P2, a different culture, and the deaf community. I can't go in that church. I can't talk. I can't hear them. Generational same thing, ethnicity. I walk in there, that's a white church. I was in a church in Florida, African-American pastor, been planting this church. It's taken years and years and years, and it's still a very small church. He's in an African-American neighborhood. He's an African-American. What I was told is he's too white. He was trained in one of our colleges, and you go into the service, and it's just like a white service. And he preaches more like a white person. And the African Americans have just said, it's just a white church. Now, it's not. It's an African American church. There are a few white people that come, and mostly African Americans, but the community is, he's too white. So it's not just skin pigmentation. There's cultural things there going on. So you look at, from their standpoint, the barriers. Language barrier, it's an English speaking, I'm Spanish speaking, I don't know how, I can't go to that church. And it may be that we have to have Spanish services and advertise Spanish services if we're going to break through that barrier, or whatever language we see in urban settings. We see Korean churches and Indian churches. We see all kinds of ethnic churches. And again, there's no simple answer to this. And then you go all the way over to the very different culture and realize that the barrier for them, they've never been in a church. They've only gone to a mosque. They don't know anything about church. And it's only going to be through personal relationships that we are able to reach into their lives and God reach into their hearts. I'm interested again. Comments, questions, how are you doing it? What's working, what's not working? Talk to me. Yes. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And that is something that seems to be not as prevalent, if it even exists at all, overseas. Churches begin under the mango tree.
Exactly.
They grow under the mango tree, and usually by the time a shelter is being built to get them out from under the mango tree, they've already replicated themselves and have started a church plant several kilometers down underneath another mango tree. And so I just wanted to mention that and perhaps get some observations from you on that.
Absolutely. I can only ditto what you said, because I have seen it, and it goes back to the church planting DNA that they have and the passion they have to reach their own people, that the building is not a hindrance to them. And I showed you pictures last whatever night it was. I guess it was yesterday afternoon. Of a meeting with these groups who are meeting outside, and they don't have a building, but they already have goals of planting more churches. And so, that is it is part of our culture. We build buildings, or we have shelters. We sometimes start churches in storefronts, community buildings, schools, whatever. But in those cultures, they just can meet under the mango tree. Yeah. Good observation. Somebody else?
Chris, I think one way to get around building barrier is that in North America is to use community small groups.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we've got probably 4 or 5 community groups, Bible homes, meeting during the weeknights, and we'll attract lost people through the dark doors.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah. Sure. Swallow ship's excellent. Yep. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yep. Good, Ken. Somebody else?
Back off that idea is, yes, we have a church building, but it doesn't have to be just a church building. It can be a community building.
Mm-hmm.